Hello, welcome. My name is Lynn O'Hara and I'm the Director of Programs at National History Day. We are so excited to have you join us for our Ask an NEH Expert series. This is the series where we talk with professionals who work in the field who practice the same skills that History Day students are developing as they work on their projects and prepare for contest season. So today we're going to be talking about multiple perspectives from the research and the presentation side. Before we get started though, I'd like to introduce my colleague Jason Harshman. Jason works at the National Endowment for the Humanities, which is a key partner for National History Day. So Jason, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Lynn, and thank you everyone for being with us for this video series. As Lynn said, I'm Jason Harshman, a program officer in the Division of Education at the National Endowment for the Humanities. Since the 1970s, the NEH has been a leading funder and partner of National History Day, including the development of free resources at our K-12 humanities education site at Siteman. Each year, the NEH awards a prize for working with the historical newspaper database Chronicling America and top projects with an NEH NHD Scholar Medal. It is our pleasure to once again work with National History Day on the production of this Ask an NEH Expert video series and to welcome Dr. Ann Peterson. Dr. Peterson is Executive Director of the Santa Barbara Trust for Historic Preservation in Santa Barbara, California. Dr. Peterson received her PhD in Public History from the University of California at Santa Barbara and a Master's in American Civilization and Museum Studies from Brown University. She has served on the Board of Directors of the Goleta Valley Historical Society, including a 3-year term as president, and currently serves as treasurer on the board of for downtown Santa Barbara. The Santa Barbara Trust for Historic Preservation was awarded a CARES Act grant by the National Endowment for the Humanities to develop digital resources and expand access to their materials for schools and the public. Thank you, Anne, for being with us for this video on multiple perspectives.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here.
Hi, Ann. Well, we are thrilled to have you here, especially from sunny California today. We want to start our discussion in talking about this idea of multiple perspectives. So we talk about it on the evaluation form. Our students' teachers talk about it, but can you start off by just kind of giving us a definition and explaining what we mean in history when we talk about multiple perspectives?
Sure. Multiple perspectives come up in the everyday life of a historian, because you might pick your topic for your project, and everyone who experienced the event or the topic that you're going to be researching probably experienced it a little bit differently. And so everyone who was there or is remembering it is going to have a different point of view on what happened and how they experienced it. And that happens for a variety of reasons based on all of our differences as people. So there are a lot of things that can affect someone's perspective on a historical event. Things like someone's age or their occupation or their income level or their race, their class, their gender. All of these qualities give people a different point of view that affects how they understand a historical event.
Can you give us an example of multiple perspectives that our students might use to kind of think about a topic differently?
Sure. At my site in Santa Barbara, and you see part of downtown Santa Barbara in my Zoom screen behind me, we operate a Spanish colonial fort that was the European founding site of our community. It was founded in 1782. And when the Spanish founded this fort, they began trade relationships and tried to hire local native Chumash people for work. And the Spanish kept meticulous records. So they documented all of these exchanges and all of everything they did. And all of those materials are available in the archive. And one way that they started their trade with native people was to offer them different objects that they were able to import from Mexico. And one of the most popular objects for native people were glass beads of a variety of colors. They were really beautiful. They were also extremely inexpensive for the Spanish to acquire. And the Spanish wrote in their records, "We don't understand why these beads are so popular with native people. They're not gemstones. They're very cheap and yet people will trade for them and work for them. And you know, their perspective was that they didn't value these objects, but this other group did, because they didn't understand that these glass trade beads had no value. So that's one perspective, and it survives very heavily in the archive. And if, as a historian, we were able to only uncover that perspective, we would have a one-sided view of what was happening in this relationship. So when we look at the native point of view, the Chumash actually had an extremely sophisticated system of currency that was based on shell beads. And the people who lived on the islands, our Channel Islands right off the coast of Santa Barbara, were masters at creating this shell bead money. And they would carve and drill the beads, and then they would circulate them into a very large region around us. And this entire region of Native people relied on this currency. It was a very elaborate system. And these glass trade beads actually fit right in to this existing currency. So it wasn't that they were an inexpensive item that the Spanish, you know, from the native perspective, could sort of get away with. It actually added to an existing system that the native people valued, and they incorporated these glass trade beads into their currency system. So when we look at it from that perspective, boy, you know, the Spanish brought something that had an existing understanding and relationship, these beads for Native people, that they were able to use for their own purposes. And so once we understand that this other perspective, we have a much fuller idea of how these trade and working relationships began with the Spanish in early California.
That's a really interesting example, because you're looking at the same thing from two different sides. Can I ask you to put on your researcher hat for a second? When you're researching, why is it important to look for these different perspectives? And what kinds of things should we consider or think about as we research when we're trying to find them?
Well, as a historian, you know, you want to put together as much evidence as you can to tell the fullest story about the event or the topic that you're looking at. So if you may find that one story appears more commonly in the historical record, and it'd be really easy to just kind of stick with that story and write about it. But then, you know, you're privileging one perspective, and your story may not be as full as it could be. So adding lots of different perspectives on the same event really helps a historian do an analysis of a wide variety of evidence, and helps us interpret this historical event with a lot more complexity, and it results in a much more sophisticated and complex story that we're able to tell about the past.
Can you give us an example of that from your work in Santa Barbara?
Sure. So this site that I told you all about, the Spanish Presidio, was a quadrangle of adobe buildings that made up this fort. And over time, when the fort was no longer needed during California's Mexican period, so after 1821, a lot of the pieces of the fort became people's private homes. And so they were deeded pieces of the adobe as their own property. In 1848, California was added to the United States as a result of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And in 1850, Santa Barbara became a brand new city in the state of California. So one of the first things that our city did was to commission a survey to lay out a street grid for the city. This was a great act of pride. The surveyor was Salisbury Haley, and we have a street called Haley Street now in his honor, because he laid out the street grid so that we could be a modern American town. And if you look at, you know, there's a map called the Wackenruder map, and Wackenruder was a cartographer who drew up the Haley survey. And this was a great point of pride to be able to show this map that, to the community. This is the future of Santa Barbara. So when we look at this map and we see how this survey was written about in the newspapers and other records, it was an example of modernization and pride. And so that might be one perspective in how you might easily find evidence to tell a story about this street grid. But when you look at at a close-up of this map, you can see that this new grid is sitting on top of buildings that are already there. And those buildings are those adobe homes. And those adobes and that fort had no relationship or need for a contemporary American street grid. So when we look for different types of evidence about this event, you can find other perspectives. And one place that you can look is in court records. So a lot of times you might find one perspective that's heavily promoted in a newspaper, and but a lot of times individuals and just regular citizens of a community, their voices can show up in different types of places, and one of those is in legal documents. So it turns out that a lot of the owners of these original adobes grouped together, and they sued the new city of Santa Barbara to save their adobe homes. And one of them you can actually see on this crop of the Wackenruder map. And it's the home of Cipriana Flores. So this was the widow of the last commandant of the Presidio. He was the highest ranking officer, and she survived in her adobe home. And this street grid was going to result in tearing down half of her home in order to build a street through it. And so we can see in a photo of the Flores adobe that the aftermath of this event. She and her fellow Californios, the descendants of the original Spanish settlers, lost their lawsuit, but it was all documented in the legal records that they protested and said, these are our homes, this is our land, you cannot tear this down to build a new street grid. And they lost, and her home, in the photo, you can see it's got a wood siding on one side. So it's an adobe home with wood siding, and that's because one room of her home was torn down to create Santa Barbara Street and was patched up with wood siding. So from her perspective, this was not an example of modernization. This was a disregard for private property. And so when we have both perspectives together, we can really understand the complexity of the change that this community was going through, and that the residents themselves had different ideas about what was the best way to move forward together.
And I think it's interesting because history is not as clear. It's not just like there's a march, this happens and that happens. There's a lot of give and take at all stages of the process. Okay, so let's kind of talk about how we do this research. So you mentioned that there's usually a dominant perspective or point of view, and that's pretty common. So how do you go about finding or identifying what other perspectives you might even want to research? How do you even know what to look for?
That's a great question. And I know you'll hear this lots of different ways through the process of doing your projects, that you want to look for as much evidence as possible and read as widely as you can about your topic. And I know that can sound overwhelming. It's been overwhelming to me over the years. And so, one tip I would have is to make sure that your topic is as specific as possible, so that doing all of that research is really realistic for you, that you have the time to be able to find all of this evidence and wade through it. That's a very time-consuming part of our job. And so what may be popping up first is this kind of dominant or popular perspective on the event. And you want to understand that very well, because that is will be a thread in your argument, and it's what you're going to compare some of these other sources to. So to find other points of view, if you're looking, you want to consider who else was involved. So first, identify the perspective that you find frequently. Whose perspective is that? Is this the perspective of a journalist who was writing about the event, or a correspondent who was writing letters and was actually there? Whose perspective do you have? And that helps you think about whose perspective might be missing. So if what you find is one type of evidence, for example, a letter or newspaper articles, what else could be out there? Some other types of evidence that often bring up different points of view could be oral histories, And oral histories are, recorded interviews with people who were present during a historical moment, or are recording a kind of a community memory of a historical moment. You might even look at photographs or architectural evidence, other material culture objects that were left behind from the event. And whatever else you might find in the archive, ephemera materials, the music, or other cultural ephemera that came out from the event. So by doing this, you can find really diverse opinions. And, at our site, the Presidio, the original Spanish fort, it's really hard to see it today because a lot of it has been torn down for other development over the years. And we have this single place in downtown Santa Barbara that began as the Spanish fort in the late 18th century. And before that was Chumash land. And then as time developed, it became the settlement for the Japanese immigrants who came to Santa Barbara, and also the Chinese immigrants who came to Santa Barbara. It was a Mexican community. And now it's a thriving area of small businesses. And so depending on what sources you look at, you might get a lot of different opinions about what this one place is and why it matters. So someone might say, my ancestors built that fort, and it's the site of the Spanish Presidio. You might have others who say, my grandfather was a barber, and he was Japanese, and he had his shop on that site. This was Nihonmachi, Japantown. You might have others who say, my father founded Jimmy's Oriental Gardens, and he ran this business in New Chinatown, and that's what this place is. And so you want to make sure that you capture all of those different points of view so that you as a historian can sort of sort them out and be able to tell a story to your audience, because they won't have had the opportunity to go through all of those materials and make sense of it the way that you did.
That's a really good point, especially when you're looking at the history of a place, that historical context matters, and that helps us identify potential perspectives. Okay, now here's something that our students sometimes get caught up in. Sometimes there's an issue where one side is maybe more right or more wrong. And how is it that you as a historian try to, deal with historical perspectives that maybe you just don't agree with for one reason or another? How do you handle that from a historian's point of view?
Well, this happens a lot because, of course, we're all people too, with our own values and our own perspectives on the world that we're shaped by, and also the events that we're looking at from the past. So I think it's real important, I do this too, is to always take a step back and think about our own perspective. And how do we feel about the events that we're looking at, and why are we researching this topic? It helps us identify that we have a perspective too as a historian. And I think once you identify your own perspective, you can, you're never going to be able to completely do this, but you can try as hard as you can to make sure that you don't let that overwhelm your understanding and your assessment of the event that you're looking at. And, when I am in the archive, I will find people through correspondence or documentation that I just think are so fascinating, and I wish I could have met them, and I want to read all about them. And I can go down a rabbit hole that takes me away from my argument because I find these figures from the past that are so compelling. I also sometimes find people from the past that I'm just, I find really unpleasant, and wish that I could have talked to them and changed their minds. And that's sort of something that you want to keep in mind as you go through the records, is that you're going to have opinions about the events of the past, but you don't want that to overwhelm your project. So your project is to find all of these perspectives, wade through them, and look for the compelling evidence that is going to make a convincing historical argument. So the fact that there are people that you agree and disagree with as the person, is of value to you in your process. But your final project needs to be able to distinguish between the evidence that you're finding and how it contributes to your argument, and your personal opinions about the evidence and the perspectives that you're finding. All of the perspectives on the past, you know, you might like them or dislike them, but agreeing or disagreeing with them is sometimes not really the question that you're interested in. You're interested in explaining to your audience change over time. How did this happen and why did it happen? And all of those perspectives of the people that you're researching can help answer that question. How did this happen?
I think that's a really good reminder for our students to let the evidence drive the argument and not the argument to go find the evidence to back it up. Okay, a lot of our students are kind of in the last phase right now. So they've got their research, they're putting together their projects. So they might be writing papers, producing documentaries, creating small museum exhibits. They might be drafting out and getting ready to record their performances or building the last pages of their website. So no matter what kind of product they're creating, can you give us some advice of ways that they can include and show the multiple perspectives that they know about in their final projects?
Sure. First of all, I can't wait to see all of the projects that you all are working on. It's really exciting, and it sounds like there is going to be a real variety of types of outcomes from all of your research. So that's great. You know, I'm familiar with doing writing projects and also doing exhibition projects, and it sounds like you are doing some of those and lots of other types of projects as well. I think within writing, you know, one thing you want to be attentive to is to always call out the perspective that you're using as a portion of your work. So if you're using an oral history, for example, you want to make sure that you introduce the person who's speaking and use quotations around their words so that you're not sort of, you know, summarizing someone's point of view to the point where it almost appears as though it's your point of view as the historian. You always want to identify who is speaking and where you got that perspective. So documenting those sources and using your footnotes becomes really important. I think I find exhibitions really fun because it's very easy in an exhibition to use lots of different types of evidence and have it all kind of flow together. So you can have quotes from an oral history on the wall alongside photographs, and also you can have cases with objects in it that all come together to help tell the story. But you know what you want to make sure you do is that you don't have a situation where you've got all of this great evidence and all these great different objects, but because you want to get everything in there. That's the challenge for the historian, is what do we not put in because we've read so much and it's all valuable to us. But make sure that every piece of evidence that you use and every point of view helps tie back to that historical argument that you're making. So if it can't help you make your argument, you've got to be really rigorous and decide, you know, maybe it doesn't need to be in here. As much as I love this one thing and this one idea, if it doesn't help me make my argument, maybe it needs to wait for another project. And those of you who will get bitten by the history bug through this will definitely have future opportunities for other projects.
Absolutely. We'll see it too. A lot of our students too, they end up getting stuck because everything in History Day has a limit. So whether it's a word limit for papers or a time limit for documentaries or performances, you've got to kind of squeeze in. And I think that's a really good piece of advice for our students. If you're over, to look at your evidence and make sure everything ties back to the argument. If it doesn't tie back to the argument, but it's a really cool photo or a really neat quote, sometimes we have to decide, do we really need it? Or is it just cool? Does it add to the argument? Does it support the argument? And if not, maybe it's just one of those kind of like cool little research rabbit holes that you go, okay, I like you. I'm going to put you in a folder and I'm going to come back to you and learn more about this person or this related event down the road. Well, Anne, I think these have been wonderful suggestions to pass along to our students and teachers. And to wrap things, I'm going to turn things back to Jason at the NEH.
Thank you, Lynn. And of course, thank you, Anne. I really like the discussion about mapping and thinking about maps with perspectives as place making and somebody trying to define that place and represent it and how that changes over time. I just really love that cartography discussion. So thank you very much. And of course, thank you for the resources and the work that's being done by the Trust in Santa Barbara. To all of you, to the parents, to the teachers and the students, we thank you for joining us for this video series. And on behalf of the National Endowment for the Humanities, we wish you all the best on your National History Day projects.